Hi guys, and welcome to our module on the trachea and bronchus. Starting with the trachea is also known as the windpipe. It is a cartilaginous tube that tends to connect the larynx found at the throat with the bronchus found at the thorax, and it is part of the lower respiratory tract alongside some of the structures like the lungs, the bronchioles, and the bronchus. There are four major functions of the trachea. This includes the conduction of air in and out of the respiratory tree. They help in forming part of the anatomic dead space. They help in warming and humidifying the air that we breathe. And then the trachea has some um, important mechanism for immunity known as the mucociliary clearance mechanism. Anatomically, the trachea tends to extend from the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage at the level of the sixth cervical vertebrae. It descends downwards vertically and ends at the junction between the fourth and fifth thoracic vertebrae. This is also the area we know as the imaginary line cutting across the sternal angle. So usually when the trachea descends to this point, it bifurcates into the left and right bronchi, and that's how it ends. And this bifurcation point of the trachea is known as the tracheal carina. So just to illustrate, the trachea begins just after the larynx at the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage. This is at C6, descends inferiorly from the neck into the thorax, and at the thorax, it ends at the junction between the superior mediastinum and the inferior mediastinum by bifurcating into right and left bronchus. So this area, this point here is the what we call the trachea carina, and it marks or ends at the junction between the fourth and fifth thoracic vertebrae, T54. In terms of dimensions, the trachea has an average length of about 9 to 15 centimeters. It is also described as having a diameter of about 2 centimeters to 2.5 centimeters. And then in terms of shape, it is cylindrical in shape anteriorly, but when we look at the trachea posteriorly, it tends to flatten out. So it has a form of C shape pattern. So anteriorly, it looks like a U, then posteriorly, it flattens out. There's a reason for this. We'll talk about that when we talk about the structure of the trachea. So in terms of the structure of the trachea, it is a rigid fibroelastic structure, and that word is very important. Rigid fibroelastic. The reason why it is rigid and fibroelastic is because of the various components we find there, both anteriorly and posteriorly. So the trachea tends to be formed by a series of cartilages. So we have about 15 to 20 C-shaped incomplete hyaline cartilage, and that a C-shaped incomplete cartilage is what gives the trachea um that's its C-shaped form or cylindrical form anteriorly. You can see how the cartilage of the trachea tends to form its anterior structure as the C-shaped pattern or U-shaped pattern, if you will. But the cartilage is incomplete, so it tends to be deficient posteriorly. So posteriorly, the cartilage is filled by a number of structures, filled by um, the annular ligament that holds it together, and a muscular structure. The muscular structure in this case is called the trachealis muscle. So the trachealis muscle completes um, the entirety of the trachea posteriorly alongside the annular ligament. The cartilage that is present anteriorly is there for a reason. It's there to maintain patency of the lumen of the trachea. Remember that trachea is there to conduct air in and out of the entire respiratory tree. And for that to be possible, we don't want the lumen of the trachea to be closing off. We want it to be continuously patent. And that patency is maintained by the trachea anteriorly. What are the relations to the trachea? So there are structures that are found anteriorly, posteriorly, lateral, and lateral to the trachea. Anteriorly, we have a number of structures found in front of the trachea. These are structures spanning the neck all the way down to the superior mediastinum. These structures include the isthmus of the thyroid gland, the inferior thyroid vein, the stenohyoid muscle and sternothyroid muscle, cervical fascia on the neck, the manubrium of the sternum in the thorax, thymus, cardiac plexus, and then the great vessels of the heart. Posteriorly, the major structure found in relation to the trachea is the esophagus. And as you see, both of those structures are largely related because of their embryology. Laterally, we have some structures that are found at the sides flanking the trachea. This includes the lobes of the thyroid gland in the neck, the inferior thyroid artery also in the neck, recurrent laryngeal nerve, and then the vagus nerve. Let's talk about the blood supply and the nerve supply to the trachea. In terms of blood supply, the trachea has different vessels that tend to supply or drain it at different level. Remember that the trachea extends from the neck to the superior mediastinum. So various vessels at different points would tend to serve the function of the trachea. In terms of the neck, we have the inferior thyroid vessels being involved in supplying or draining trachea at the neck. Then when we go lower down to the mediastinum, to the thorax, we have the bronchial vessels and the internal thoracic vessels being involved in serving the trachea. The nerve supply, this also tends to differ when talking about the trachea in terms of the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and the somatic nerves that supplies the trachea. In terms of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves, we have the vagus nerve being involved in the parasympathetic supply to the trachea. We have the sympathetic nerves or trunk also supplying the trachea, and then we have the recurrent laryngeal nerve being involved in supplying the somatic aspect of the trachea. Let's talk lymphatics. We have about four major lymph nodes involved in draining lymph from the trachea. These are well distributed across the different aspects of the trachea from the neck all the way down to the carina. And we have each of the nodes specific to those areas. So the deep cervical nodes are found in the neck and they drain the trachea at the neck region. The paratracheal nodes, the tracheobronchial nodes, and the pretracheal nodes are all found within the mediastinum, and they are all involved in draining lymph from the trachea at the mediastinum or at the thorax. Talking about the embryology of the trachea, so in terms of the embryology of the trachea tends to be derived from the primitive foregut. And the way in which this occurs, first of all, the foregut starts off as a tube around the fourth week, but um, eventually progresses into forming a pouch, an out pouching. The out pouching that comes out from the trachea, from the foregut, is known as the respiratory diverticulum. So the very first sign of development of the trachea is the presence of the respiratory diverticulum, which is an outpouching on the ventral wall of the foregut. So let's say this yellow structure here is the foregut. You can see that at the fourth week we have that outpouching in blue coming out. This outpouching is known as the respiratory diverticulum. With time, the respiratory diverticulum starts to separate itself from the foregut. So that separation from the foregut usually is made possible by what we call a tracheoesophageal ridge. So if you notice, initially the respiratory diverticulum and the foregut are in direct communication and in open communication. But eventually, with time, we start to see an indentation of the mesoderm into the between the respiratory diverticulum and the foregut, and that indentation tends to give rise to what we call the tracheoesophageal fold. So this tracheoesophageal fold or ridge, with time, pinches into or moves towards one another, eventually separates the foregut from the respiratory diverticulum. And at the end of the day, we start to see two new tubes. The one in front that is gotten from the respiratory diverticulum will become the trachea. Then the one in back that is the continuation of the foregut becomes the esophagus. So another thing to notice is that the tracheal epithelium and glands are usually derived from endoderm, whereas some of those other structures that forms the trachea, like the tracheal smooth muscle, tracheal connective tissue, and then the C-shaped cartilage that I said maintains the patency of the trachea, are usually gotten from visceral mesoderm. So that's a very important distinction to make. So this just elaborating on the embryology of the trachea. As the tracheoesophageal folds form together, they eventually will move towards the midline and then fuse. So this is the tracheoesophageal fold or ridge. You'll see that as they are forming, they are also moving towards each other, and then eventually, once they meet and fuse, they fuse at midline, giving rise to what we call a tracheoesophageal septum. It's now that septum that clearly divides the ventral respiratory diverticulum from the um, dorsal foregut. And once that septum automatically forms, it divides the entire foregut into ventral trachea, which is gotten from the respiratory diverticulum, and then the dorsal esophagus, which is gotten from the continuation of the foregut. Then the respiratory diverticulum eventually goes ahead to give rise to the entire bronchus and lungs, as shown in the image below. So you can see how this would form the lungs and the bronchus. Histologically, the trachea is divided into four major parts. So you have four major walls of the trachea that surrounds its lumen, and these structures are described from inside to outside as a mucosa layer. First of all, then we have the submucosa layer, then we have the cartilage, and then we have the muscle. Starting off with the mucosa of the trachea. So the mucosa is the innermost layer of the trachea. It tends to line the lumen of the trachea. And what is important to note about the mucosa is that it contains two portions. It contains an epithelium and a lamina propria. The epithelium is made up of epithelial tissues, particularly pseudostratified columnar epithelium lines the trachea. The pseudostratified columnar epithelium of the trachea tends to be ciliated. Then the lamina propria of the trachea is made up of loose connective tissues underneath the epithelium, and they are highly vascularized. In terms of the submucosa of the trachea, submucosa of the trachea contains a number of glands, usually what we call seromucous glands. These glands are involved in secreting mucus into the trachea. The mucus tend to provide thick protective layers over the epithelium, and the serous part of the seromucous gland produces watery secretion, whereas the mucous part of the seromucous gland tends to produce viscid mucus secretion. The other two outer portions of the trachea is the cartilage and the muscle. We talked about this before, but just to recap, the outer part of the trachea is made up of an anterior C-shaped cartilage that is made up of hyaline. So this hyaline cartilage that forms the outermost part of the C-shaped rings, and the gaps tend to be filled by the muscle and fibroelastic tissue. Usually, the muscle is known as the trachealis muscle. Is a bundle of smooth muscle found at the back of the trachea that helps in also maintaining patency and as well helps in determining the diameter of the trachea. So to conclude this model, let's talk about some of the important clinical significance of the trachea. This includes tracheostomy and tracheotomy, as well as the carina and the tracheoesophageal fistula. Our focus will be on the tracheoesophageal fistula because it is anatomically relevant to our discussion. So tracheoesophageal fistula describes a condition, an embryonic condition, or anomaly whereby we have problems with the development of the trachea from the foregut. Remember that for trachea to form, we have the tracheoesophageal ridge and then tracheoesophageal septum arising and dividing the foregut into a ventral trachea and a dorsal esophagus. When this process does not take place as it should, we have a number of defects that could occur. And the sum total of this defect is usually termed as tracheoesophageal fistula, where we have an abnormal connection between the trachea and the esophagus. And we have different forms of tracheoesophageal fistula slash esophageal atresia. So we could have the most common type is where we have the tracheoesophageal fistula occurring distally, whereby first of all we have the esophagus first proximally ending as an outpouching. So you have what we call a proximal esophageal atresia, and then we have a distal tracheoesophageal fistula whereby the trachea and the distal esophagus are connected. So this is the distal esophagus here. So this is DE. You can see the distal esophagus is still connected to the trachea. So we call that the distal tracheoesophageal fistula, whereas the rest of the esophagus proximally ends as a as a blind pouch. So this is the most common form of the tracheoesophageal fistula that we have. We have some other forms. We have a form in which we just have the esophagus ending by itself, esophageal atresia that is isolated. We have another form whereby the only thing we see is the connection between the trachea and the esophagus. So proximal esophagus and distal esophagus are connected to the trachea. This forms a form of H-shaped or K-shaped defect. We have where we just have a proximal um, tracheoesophageal fistula where the esophagus and the trachea are connected proximally, and then the esophagus ends distally. So we have a distal esophageal atresia, and we have a scenario where both the proximal and distal esophageal fistula are connected to the trachea separately. So we have proximal tracheoesophageal fistula and then a distal tracheoesophageal fistula. The one you need to really remember is the first, which is the most common. About 85% or 87% of time or cases tend to present as a distal tracheoesophageal fistula with a proximal esophageal atresia. The second aspect of this model will be on the bronchus. The bronchus is the continuation of the trachea. It's a musculo-cartilaginous tube connected to the trachea and continues down the respiratory tree as the bronchioles of the lung. It also forms part of the lower respiratory tract alongside the trachea, the larynx, and the bronchioles and the lungs. The bronchus is divided into three major parts because of its multiple divisions. If you pay close attention to the image, you notice that from the trachea we have the bronchus dividing at different points. First of all, the trachea will divide into two major bronchus, what we call the primary bronchus in red. Primary bronchus will further divide into secondary or lobar bronchus, so you can see in different colors, the green, yellow, and the green, the yellow, and the blue. And then finally, we have the secondary bronchus now further dividing into smaller bronchus as shown here. So these are examples of some of the smaller bronchus. These are the tertiary bronchus or the segmental bronchus. And these bronchus or bronchi would eventually become the bronchioles after they subdivide within the lungs. So we'll talk about each of the different forms of bronchus we have, starting with the primary bronchi. It tends to begin at the level of the sternal angle at the point where the trachea bifurcates. So the trachea bifurcation gives rise to the right main bronchus, or what they call the right primary bronchus, and then the left main bronchus or the left primary bronchus. And this would eventually feed off to supply the lungs. Both of these bronchi tend to be mobile, they tend to be elastic, they tend to have a U-shaped cartilaginous ring, just like the trachea, but smaller. And these rings eventually becomes plates when the bronchus or the bronchi becomes intrapulmonary. So once these main bronchus enter into the lungs, the U-shaped cartilaginous rings becomes more of plates that tend to pad the bronchus and makes it patent, while air tends to be conducted to and through the respiratory tree. The right primary bronchus or the right main bronchus tends to be different from the left due to some certain features. So the right primary bronchus is shorter than the left, is wider than the left, and it is more vertical than the left. And this is very important because of some clinical significances like foreign body aspiration. Whenever we aspirate foreign bodies, it's likely that that foreign body would go to the right lung than the left lung because of the this configuration of the right primary bronchus. Because it is more vertical than the left, um, foreign objects could easily enter into the right bronchus and then from there to the right lungs. The right primary bronchus tends to run under the arc of the azygos vein. That's its relation, and then it ends by dividing into the secondary bronchi. The left primary bronchus to the left main bronchus is distinct from the right by virtue of the fact that it is longer than the right, it is narrower than the right, and it is more diagonal than the right main bronchus. It runs inferiolateral to the or to the arc of the aorta. So just as the right main bronchus is related to the arc of the azygos vein, The left primary bronchus is related to the arc of the aorta. It crosses anteriorly to the esophagus and the thoracic aorta, and it's also crossed superiorly by the arc of aorta over its proximal part and by the left pulmonary artery over its distal part. So just talking about the relations of the left primary bronchus. Then it ends by bifurcating by dividing to form the secondary bronchi, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So here's a short summary outlining the differences between the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. So just to recap, the right primary bronchus is shorter, the left is longer, the right primary bronchus is wider, the left is narrower. The right primary bronchus is more vertical in its orientation, the left is more diagonal. The right primary bronchus runs inferior to the azygos vein, the left runs inferior to the arc of the aorta. And then the right primary bronchus divides to form three secondary bronchi, which we'll talk about very soon. And then the left divides to form two secondary bronchus, which we'll also talk about soon. Secondary bronchi, the continuation of the primary bronchus. The primary bronchus would eventually bifurcate to form the secondary bronchi. Secondary bronchi is also known as the lobar bronchus because they start to be well founded within the lobes of the lungs. We have right and left lobar or secondary bronchi. They're usually multiple in number. So the right secondary lobar bronchi are three in numbers, whereas the left secondary bronchi are two in numbers. You can see, you can count the three secondary bronchus on the right side, and we can count the two secondary bronchus on the left side. In terms of the structure of the secondary bronchi, they are mobile, they're elastic, and they have crescent-shaped cartilaginous ring. You can see how from the trachea down to the bronchi, the shapes of the cartilaginous ring tends to differ. When we start from the trachea, we have them C-shaped and large. When we get to the primary bronchus, they are U-shaped, and eventually get into the secondary bronchus, they become crescent-shaped and plated. There are three major right secondary bronchi. This includes the superior secondary bronchus, the middle secondary bronchus, and the inferior secondary bronchus. The superior secondary bronchus is unique in terms of the fact that at the hilum of the lungs, where it enters into, it tends to be referred to as the epi-arterial bronchus. This is because of its relation to the pulmonary artery. It tends to be found above the pulmonary artery. When we talk about the lungs in a separate model, and we talk about the hilum of the lungs, we'll be able to distinguish the superior bronchus, superior secondary bronchus on the right side from the others. The rest of the secondary bronchi on the right side, as the middle and the inferior, are known as the hypoarterial bronchi because they're found inferior to the pulmonary artery. All of these bronchi would eventually divide to form the tertiary or segmental bronchi, and we'll talk about very soon. On the left side, we have two major secondary bronchi. This includes the superior secondary bronchus and the inferior secondary bronchus. And what you just need to note about that is just like the right secondary bronchus, they feed into the lungs. Eventually, they would further divide to form this tertiary bronchi. Let's recap the differences between the right secondary bronchi and the left secondary bronchi. What you need to remember is the fact that the right secondary bronchi are three in number, superior, middle, and inferior, and then the left secondary bronchi are two in number, superior and inferior. Both of them would eventually divide to form tertiary bronchi. On the right side, we have a total of 10 tertiary bronchi coming from the three secondary bronchi. And then on the left side, we have a total of 8 tertiary bronchi coming from the two secondary bronchi. So within the lungs, we start to see the secondary bronchi dividing to form a tertiary bronchus. The tertiary bronchi are usually also called segmental bronchi. There are multiple numbers of bronchi that are found within the right and the left lungs. So we have right segmental or tertiary bronchi and the left segmental or tertiary bronchi. In terms of shape or structure, they are mobile, they are elastic, and they are made up of crescent-shaped cartilaginous ring, just like the secondary bronchus. The tertiary bronchus are unique because they eventually fit into a very important aspect of the lung we call the bronchopulmonary segment. So just as the trachea forms the main bronchus forms the secondary bronchus forms the tertiary bronchus. tertiary bronchus would eventually divide to form the bronchopulmonary segment. The bronchopulmonary segment is just a fancy way of saying the bronchioles and the alveoli of the lungs alongside some other minor structures. We have 10 major right tertiary bronchi. Um, each of these are usually numbered and they feed off into different parts of the lungs. So if to divide each of them based on where they are gotten from, remember that we started off with three secondary or lobar bronchus. We have the superior, the middle, and the inferior. Each of them give rise to different numbers of tertiary bronchus that would eventually aggregate to form 10 right tertiary bronchus. So the superior lobar bronchus forms three segmental bronchi, apical, posterior, and anterior. The middle lobar or secondary bronchus gives rise to two segmental or tertiary bronchi. These are lateral and lingual and the medial lingual. And then finally, the inferior lobar or secondary bronchus gives rise to five segmental or tertiary bronchi. This includes the superior basal, the medial basal, the lateral basal, the anterior basal, and the posterior basal. And this is how we amount to having 10 right tertiary bronchi. At the end of the day, each of these 10 right tertiary bronchi would eventually divide to form the bronchioles. So the bronchioles will now feed off to form the part of the bronchopulmonary segment that we talked about. On the left side, we have a total of 8 left tertiary bronchi, each gotten from the different um, two main bronchus or of the two secondary bronchus rather of the left lung. So just to recap, we have two secondary bronchus of the left lung, superior and inferior. The superior lobar bronchus or superior secondary bronchus forms two major divisions. It forms the superior divisions and the lingual division. Superior division of would give rise to two segmental bronchi or two tertiary bronchus. This includes the apical posterior and the anterior tertiary bronchus. Then the lingual division gives rise also to two segmental bronchi. This includes the superior lingual bronchus and the inferior lingual bronchus. Then if the inferior or lobar bronchus or the inferior secondary bronchus of the left lung would form four segmental bronchi. These four includes the superior basal, the anterior medial basal, the posterior basal, and the lateral basal tertiary bronchus of the left lung. Now, just to recap each of the different aspects of the tertiary bronchus, distinguishing the right from the left. On the right side, we have a total of 10 tertiary bronchus divided into 3 from the superior secondary bronchus, 2 from the middle secondary bronchus, and then 5 from the inferior secondary bronchus. On the left side, we have a total of 8 left tertiary bronchi, each gotten from the each divided equally amongst the superior and inferior um, secondary bronchi. So 4 comes from the superior secondary bronchus, then the remaining 4 comes from the inferior secondary bronchus. On both sides, the right and the left, the tertiary bronchus would further divide from the bronchioles, and then the bronchioles would eventually form part of the bronchopulmonary segment, which we'll talk about in a separate model. Let's talk about the neurovascular supply to the entire bronchus. The bronchus are supplied by bronchial arteries and bronchial veins. In terms of the lymphatic drainage, you are drained by the bronchopulmonary nodes and the tracheobronchial nodes in the thorax. And in terms of the nerve supply, they are supplied by the cardiac plexus and the pulmonary plexus. In terms of the embryology of the bronchus, the embryology of the bronchus continues from the embryology of the trachea. Remember that the trachea is gotten from the respiratory diverticulum, and once that diverticulum forms the trachea, it eventually divides to form the lung bud. The lung bud will first of all divide into two bronchial buds. So we start with the trachea continuing or the respiratory diverticulum beginning from the trachea and forming the lung bud. The lung buds will divide into two bronchial buds as shown here, and then the bronchial buds along the line start to further divide into smaller divisions. So in the fifth week of development, the bronchial buds usually enlarge to form the main primary bronchus. Remember that we have two main primary bronchus. Those two main primary bronchus are gotten from the two bronchial buds as shown here. Then the Um, just as we described, the right main bronchus tends to be larger and more vertical than the left main bronchus. Um, and I described how that relationship is um, tends to affect foreign body being aspirated into the right side rather than the left side. So the two main bronchus cutting from the bronchial board further subdivides to form the lobar secondary bronchi. So we have the right main bronchus or the right bronchial board forming three secondary bronchi, the left um, bronchial board subdividing to form two um, secondary bronchi, and this will correspond to the lobes of the lung, also corresponding to the number of secondary bronchus we have in the lungs. Then the lobar bronchus further divides into segmental bronchus, or we call tertiary bronchus. On the right side, the three lobar bronchus or bronchi subdivides to form 10 tertiary bronchus, 10 segmental bronchus, and then the two left um, secondary bronchus further divides to form 9 tertiary segmental or the segmental bronchi. Segmental bronchi are usually the primordial to the bronchopulmonary sequence, and they are morphologically and functionally separate respiratory units, as we'll discuss in a separate module. As the bronchus or the bronchi develop, they expand laterally and caudally into the space known as the primitive pleural cavity, and eventually they'll give rise to the entire respiratory tree. So this is just an image depicting the entire embryology of the bronchi. As shown, we start with a single foregut that will divide to form the respiratory diverticulum. The respiratory diverticulum will automatically develop to give rise to a ventral trachea and nasal esophagus. The trachea will develop for that from the lung buds. We have a bronchial bud just being two initially, then the two bronchial buds will further divide to form segmental bronchus. Segmental bronchus will further divide to form secondary bronchus. Secondary bronchus will further divide to form segmental bronchus. And then segmental bronchus will further develop to form the bronchopulmonary segments, which forms the lungs, as shown in the image below. Histologically, the bronchi is very similar to the trachea in terms of its walls. We have four major walls of the entire bronchus. These walls from inside to outside includes the mucosa, submucosa, the cartilages, and the muscles. The In terms of the epithelium of the epithelium of the mucosa is lined by ciliated columnar epithelium. The submucosa tends to produce a lot of glands that helps in secretion into the lumen of the bronchus, just like the trachea. The cartilages that tend to surround the bronchus tend to maintain its patency. They're usually smaller fragments compared to that of the trachea. And then the muscle that surrounds the outer part of the bronchus is made up of smooth muscle, then circles the entire bronchus, and it tends to undergo contraction or relaxation to control the diameter of the airway. Usually, in terms of the diameter, the tertiary bronchus tend to be the smallest type of bronchus and has a diameter of about 1 millimeter. So in terms of clinical significance, what you need to remember would be a foreign body aspiration. I mentioned the fact that most foreign objects tend to be aspirated into the right bronchus rather than the left, and this is because of the vertical orientation of the right bronchus as compared to the left. Other forms of clinical significances include chronic bronchitis, which is an inflammation of the bronchus, asthma, and then bronchiectasis, which are pathologies of the entire bronchial tree. This is a picture depicting for us what occurs in asthma. In asthma, we have two major things happening. We have the muscular aspect of the bronchus undergoing excessive contraction, and we also have the mucosa, the glands present within the mucosa of the bronchus undergoing hyperplasia or increase in their size and number. And as a result, this will lead to a reduction in lumen diameter of the trachea, and this can stifle rather can stifle the passage of conduction of air across the entire bronchial tree. As a result, presentation of a typical asthma patient is that of difficulty in breathing. The reason why they're having that is because air is not moving freely across the bronchus due to a reduction in its diameter. Chronic bronchitis is quite similar. In chronic bronchitis, what we tend to see is we see excess mucus production and inflammation across the entire lumen, and this also stifles passage or conduction of air across the entire bronchus. Bronchiectasis tends to be a very unique or distinct form of pathology. In bronchiectasis, what we see is we see an abnormally dilated bronchus, and this abnormally dilated bronchus gives way for the excessive production of mucus and eventually damage to the cell wall. This increased production of mucus tends to harbor bacterial growth. So usually we have tend to see a number of bacteria or microorganisms growing within the bronchus, and from there this can further damage the walls of the bronchus. And that concludes our model on the trachea and the bronchus.